where the Tiber meets the hills. Long before Rome ruled the Mediterranean, the place itself was modest. The Tiber River curved through central Italy, not far from the Western Sea, and a cluster of hills rose above marshy low ground. The location was useful without appearing destined for greatness. The river offered water and a crossing point. The hills offered defensible ground. Routes from the interior of Italy met routes that followed the coast. Communities in Latium could trade with Etruscans to the north and Greek settlements farther south. Over time, small settlements on the Palatine, Capitoline, and neighboring hills became more closely connected. What later Romans remembered as the birth of a single city was probably a gradual process of villages becoming one urban community. From the air, modern Rome spreads far beyond those early hills, yet the ancient landscape still helps explain the beginning. The river, the valleys, the ridges, and the roads formed a natural meeting place. Rome began not as an empire, but as one settlement among many in a busy Italian world. Romulus, Remus, and memory. Romans told a famous story about twin brothers, Romulus and Remus, raised by a she-wolf after being abandoned beside the Tiber. According to tradition, Romulus eventually founded Rome in 753 BCE and gave the city his name. The story is not a simple historical record. It belongs to the world of myth, memory, identity, and political meaning. Later Romans used it to explain the city's toughness, divine favor, and complicated relationship with violence and brotherhood. Archaeology gives us a different kind of evidence. It shows settlement on the hills, changing burial practices, imported goods, early walls, and increasing urban organization. The legend and the archaeology do not need to cancel each other out. One tells us how Romans imagined their beginnings. The other helps us reconstruct how a real community developed. For a sleep history journey, it is useful to hold both images quietly together, a riverbank remembered in story, and a real landscape where farmers, herders, traders, and craftsmen slowly built a town. The Age of Kings. Roman tradition remembered 7 kings who ruled before the Republic. Some names may preserve echoes of real rulers, while others were shaped by later storytelling. What matters historically is that early Rome was strongly influenced by neighboring cultures, especially the Etruscans. Monumental building increased. Drainage works transformed low ground. Temples rose on important hills. The Forum gradually became a civic center where religion, politics, law, exchange, and public ceremony met. Rome was becoming more than a group of villages. It was becoming a city-state. The early kingship also left institutions that survived after kings disappeared. Religious offices, assemblies, aristocratic families, and traditions of public authority all developed in this formative period. Later Romans often described the monarchy as something they had rejected, but they continued to use many structures inherited from it. Rome's future strength came partly from this habit of adaptation. The city repeatedly absorbed institutions, technologies, and people from others, then reshaped them into something Roman. Etruscans, Greeks, and an open city. Early Rome grew in a peninsula already filled with older cultures. Etruscan cities to the north possessed skilled metalworkers, monumental temples, complex religious traditions, and strong trading connections. Greek colonies in southern Italy brought alphabetic writing, art, coinage, and Mediterranean commerce close to Roman territory. Rome borrowed from both worlds without becoming a copy of either. The Latin alphabet ultimately developed through this cultural chain. Religious rituals, architectural forms, military equipment, and symbols of authority all reveal exchange. Even the city's population was never purely one people. Merchants, migrants, captives, artisans, and neighboring families moved through the Tiber Valley. This openness became one of Rome's unusual strengths. Roman identity could expand. Outsiders could become allies, residents, citizens, and eventually even emperors. The city's later empire was built on conquest, but also on an old habit of absorbing useful customs and incorporating new communities. Patricians, plebeians, and compromise. The early republic faced tension between aristocratic patrician families and the broader body of citizens known as plebeians. Roman tradition described a long conflict of the orders in which plebeians demanded legal and political protections. They gained their own officials, the tribunes of the plebs, who could defend citizens and block some official actions. The 12 Tables, an early written law code, helped make legal rules more publicly known. Over generations, access to high office expanded. The outcome was not social equality. A new elite formed from wealthy families of different backgrounds, and poor Romans could still face debt and insecurity. Yet the pattern was important. Rome often survived internal conflict through negotiation and the gradual inclusion of new groups. This ability to widen participation while keeping older institutions intact later helped Rome manage conquered communities as well. Roman expansion was not based only on force. It was also built on carefully graded relationships, alliances, and different levels of citizenship. The Roman soldier. Rome's military power grew from its society. In the early Republic, soldiers were citizens called to serve when campaigns demanded it. They fought in formations that changed over time as Rome encountered different enemies and landscapes. The later legion became famous for discipline and flexibility, but it was not a timeless machine that appeared fully formed. Roman military organization evolved through centuries of experience. Soldiers marched, dug camps, built roads, carried equipment, guarded supplies, and spent far more time waiting and working than fighting. Commanders depended on scouts, engineers, cavalry, allied troops, pack animals, craftsmen, and administrators. The army's greatest advantage was often persistence. Rome could suffer a major defeat, raise new forces, and continue. That resilience depended on a large network of citizens and allies across Italy. When Rome later conquered distant regions, the legion became both a military force and an instrument of infrastructure, building forts, bridges, roads, and settlements that tied frontier landscapes to the wider Roman world. Inside a legionary camp, a Roman army on campaign carried a moving routine with it. At the end of a march, soldiers could construct a fortified camp with ditches, ramparts, gates, streets, and assigned spaces for units and commanders. Permanent forts on the frontiers developed the same sense of order in stone and timber. Barracks, workshops, granaries, headquarters buildings, hospitals, and bathhouses created small military towns. Supplies mattered as much as weapons. Grain had to arrive. Animals needed fodder. Shoes wore out. Metal equipment required repair. Letters and pay records moved through clerical offices. Archaeology at forts has preserved wooden tablets, tools, shoes, pottery, and food remains that reveal this ordinary military world. The legion's discipline was not only visible in battle formation. It was visible in the ability to reproduce organized life wherever the army went. Conquering Italy. During the 4th and 3rd centuries BC, Rome expanded across the Italian peninsula through a long series of wars, alliances, defeats, recoveries, and negotiated settlements. The Samnite Wars tested Roman power in the mountains of central and southern Italy. Greek cities in the south brought Rome into contact with another military tradition. Etruscan communities to the north were gradually drawn into Roman dominance. Rome did not treat every defeated community in exactly the same way. Some received citizenship. Others kept local institutions but owed troops. Colonies of Roman or Latin settlers were established at strategic points. Roads connected these communities to the capital and to each other. This layered system turned conquest into a network. Local elites could often preserve status by cooperating with Rome, while Rome gained soldiers and resources. By the early 3rd century BCE, the city had become the leading power in Italy. The next stage would carry Roman armies beyond the peninsula. Colonies and the web of Italy. As Rome expanded through Italy, it planted colonies at strategic locations. Some were settlements of Roman citizens. Others had Latin status, with rights and obligations that differed from full Roman citizenship. The purpose was practical. Colonies guarded roads, watched coastlines, secured conquered territory, and created dependable centers of Roman influence. They were not isolated military outposts. Families lived there, Farms surrounded them, and local markets linked settlers with older communities. Rome's network of treaties allowed many Italian allies to keep their own councils and laws while supplying troops for Roman wars. This system could be demanding and unequal, but it gave conquered peoples a place inside a larger structure. When Rome fought Carthage, the loyalty of much of this network proved decisive. The peninsula had become something more durable than a collection of occupied towns. It was a connected political landscape. Roads across the peninsula. One of Rome's most enduring tools of expansion was the road. The Via Appia, begun in 312 BCE, linked Rome with southern Italy and eventually reached the Adriatic port of Brundisium. Roman roads were not all identical stone highways, but major routes were carefully surveyed, drained, and maintained. They helped armies move, yet their importance went far beyond war. Officials, merchants, messengers, travelers, migrants, and local farmers used them. Inns, towns, shrines, tombs, and marketplaces developed along the routes. Milestones expressed state authority by naming emperors or officials responsible for construction and repair. A road turned distance into something more manageable. It could carry an order from Rome toward a frontier and bring taxes, goods, and news back in the other direction. Seen from above, straight ancient roads crossing the countryside remind us that Roman power worked through movement. Conquest was easier to hold when people, information, and supplies could travel reliably across the landscape. Pyrrhus and the Greek South. When Rome pushed into southern Italy, it encountered Greek cities that had existed there for centuries. The city of Tarentum called for help from King Pyrrhus of Epirus, a skilled Hellenistic ruler who arrived with professional troops and war elephants. Pyrrhus defeated Roman armies in several battles, but at great cost. The expression Pyrrhic victory later came to describe a success so expensive that it weakens the victor. Rome's response showed a pattern that would become familiar. It refused to accept a limited defeat as a final decision. New armies appeared. Allies remained largely loyal. Pyrrhus eventually withdrew from Italy, and Rome consolidated control of the south. The conflict also introduced Romans more directly to the political world of the Greek Mediterranean. Italy was now almost entirely within Rome's sphere. Across the narrow waters to the southwest lay Sicily, an island where Roman and Carthaginian interests would soon collide. Carthage across the sea. Carthage stood on the North African coast, near modern Tunis. Founded by Phoenician settlers centuries earlier, it became the center of a wealthy maritime power. Carthaginian merchants and fleets operated across the western Mediterranean. Sicily, Sardinia, North Africa, and parts of Iberia connected through networks of trade, tribute, and military influence. Rome and Carthage had not always been enemies. Earlier treaties regulated their relations. But as Roman power reached southern Italy and Carthaginian power remained strong in Sicily, the two states found themselves facing the same strategic space. The result was the First Punic War, beginning in 264 BC. Rome was still primarily a land power, while Carthage had generations of naval experience. For Rome to compete, it had to learn to fight at sea. This conflict would begin a transformation. By its end, Rome would no longer be only an Italian power. Learning to fight at sea. The First Punic War lasted more than 2 decades. Rome built fleets on a scale it had never attempted before. Ancient accounts describe Romans copying aspects of captured Carthaginian ship designs, though the story is simplified by later tradition. Naval war demanded huge resources: timber, crews, shipyards, training, harbor facilities, and money. Storms destroyed entire fleets. Battles destroyed others. Yet Rome repeatedly rebuilt. Sicily became the central prize. Roman commanders experimented with tactics that allowed their infantry skills to matter at sea, including boarding enemy ships. In 241 BCE, after years of exhaustion, Rome won a decisive naval victory near the Aegean Islands. Carthage gave up Sicily, which became Rome's first overseas province. Soon Rome also took Sardinia and Corsica. The Republic had crossed a threshold. It now governed territory beyond Italy, and provincial administration would become a permanent part of Roman politics. Sicily, grain, and the first province. Sicily became Rome's first major overseas province after the First Punic War. The island had fertile plains, old Greek cities, Phoenician settlements, and a strategic position in the center of the Mediterranean. Roman rule introduced a new relationship between the capital and distant territory. Governors represented Roman authority. Local communities paid taxes or grain obligations under varying arrangements. Merchants followed the armies, and senators became increasingly interested in overseas land and contracts. Sicily's grain later helped feed Rome's growing population. The province also taught the Republic that conquest created long-term administrative responsibilities. Winning a war was only the beginning. Roads, courts, taxation, local elites, shipping, and military security all had to be managed year after year. The model developed in Sicily would be repeated, modified, and expanded across the Mediterranean. Hannibal and the Alps. The peace did not last. Carthage rebuilt its position in Iberia, where the general Hamilcar Barca and later his family created a powerful base. In 218 BCE, Hamilcar's son Hannibal began one of antiquity's most famous campaigns. Instead of attacking by sea, he led an army from Iberia, across southern Gaul, and over the Alps into Italy. The crossing became legendary because of its scale, difficult terrain, uncertain weather, and the presence of war elephants. The exact route is still debated. What matters is the strategic surprise. Hannibal appeared in northern Italy where Rome had not expected such a large Carthaginian army. The alpine landscape itself became part of the story. Narrow passes, steep slopes, cold air, and long valleys turned movement into an ordeal before the main campaign had even begun. Yet Hannibal reached Italy and soon defeated several Roman armies. Cannae and Roman persistence. In 216 BCE, at Cannae in southern Italy, Hannibal won one of the most famous victories in military history. A large Roman army was surrounded and destroyed through a carefully executed battle plan. The defeat shocked Rome and encouraged some allies to change sides. Yet the Republic did not surrender. This response is central to understanding Roman expansion. Rome possessed political determination, deep manpower reserves, and an alliance system that could survive extraordinary pressure. Roman commanders increasingly avoided giving Hannibal the decisive battle he wanted. They attacked his supporters, defended key regions, and opened new fronts elsewhere. The war spread to Sicily, Iberia, and eventually North Africa. Hannibal remained in Italy for years, but he could not break the Roman system completely. The Republic's strength was not that it never lost. It was that it could continue after losses that might have ended the ambitions of another state. Scipio and the end of the Punic War. Roman forces in Iberia gradually weakened Carthaginian power there under the leadership of Publius Cornelius Scipio, later known as Africanus. Scipio then carried the war to North Africa. This forced Hannibal to leave Italy and return home. In 202 BCE, the two commanders met at Zama. Rome won, and Carthage accepted harsh peace terms. The Second Punic War left Rome the dominant military power in the western Mediterranean. Carthage survived as a city but lost its empire. Rome gained influence in Iberia and a stronger position in North Africa. The cost had been enormous for communities across Italy and beyond. Farms, towns, families, and political relationships had been disrupted. Yet the war also accelerated Rome's transformation. The Republic now possessed overseas armies, provincial commands, large flows of wealth, and political leaders whose reputations were built in distant campaigns. Success abroad would soon create new tensions at home. Hispania and the Long Conquest. Rome's victory over Carthage brought it deep into the Iberian Peninsula, but controlling Hispania took generations. Mountain communities, river valleys, mining districts, and coastal cities created a complicated landscape. Roman armies fought long campaigns far from Italy, while silver and other resources made the region economically important. Some wars became symbols of stubborn resistance, including the struggle around Numantia. Over time, military roads, colonies, and towns connected the peninsula more closely with the Roman world. Latin spread gradually, though local languages and customs persisted. Centuries later, Hispania would produce senators, writers, and emperors, including Trajan and Hadrian. A region once treated as a distant battlefield became one of the most thoroughly integrated parts of the empire. This transformation shows how Roman conquest often changed meaning across time. A frontier could become a province, and a province could eventually become a center of Roman life. Rome turns east. After defeating Carthage, Rome became increasingly involved in the eastern Mediterranean. The Hellenistic kingdoms that had emerged after Alexander the Great were powerful but divided. Rome fought Macedon, intervened in Greek politics, and eventually defeated the Seleucid king Antiochus III. Roman leaders often claimed they were defending allies or restoring freedom, but intervention gradually became control. Macedonia became a province. Greece was brought under Roman dominance. The wealthy kingdom of Pergamon was later bequeathed to Rome, forming the basis of the province of Asia. These eastern territories brought immense cultural and economic influence into Roman life. Greek art, philosophy, literature, education, medicine, and architecture fascinated Roman elites. Conquest did not create a simple relationship in which Rome changed everyone else. Rome itself changed as it conquered. Greek teachers educated Roman aristocrats. Greek statues filled Roman houses. Eastern trade enriched Italian ports. Empire was becoming a two-way exchange, even when political power was unequal. The price of expansion. Conquest brought land, enslaved people, taxes, tribute, and opportunities for wealthy Romans. It also placed enormous pressure on the political system. Generals spent years commanding armies far from Rome. Soldiers could be absent from farms for long campaigns. Large estates expanded in some parts of Italy. Competition for office became more expensive and intense because successful politicians could gain access to provincial wealth. The Republic had been designed for a city-state and an Italian alliance network. It was now governing territories from Iberia to the Aegean. Decisions made in the Forum affected millions of people who had no direct voice in Roman politics. The Senate tried to control governors and commanders, but corruption and rivalry were persistent problems. Empire gave Rome power, yet power magnified existing tensions. In the 2nd century BC, reformers began arguing over land, citizenship, military service, and the distribution of conquest's rewards. The Gracchi. Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, two brothers from an elite family, became symbols of the Republic's social conflict. As tribunes in the late 2nd century BCE, they proposed reforms intended to address land distribution, citizenship, grain supply, and political accountability. Their programs gained popular support and fierce opposition. Both brothers died in episodes of political violence. The details and motives remain debated, but their deaths mattered because they showed that traditional compromise was breaking down. Violence had entered competition between Roman political factions in a new way. Later politicians learned that crowds, tribunician powers, emergency decrees, and personal loyalty could be used aggressively. The Republic did not collapse immediately. It continued for generations. But the political atmosphere became harder. Rome had conquered an enormous world, yet its ruling class increasingly struggled to agree on how the benefits and burdens of that world should be shared. Marius, Sulla, and armies of loyalty. At the end of the 2nd century BCE, Gaius Marius rose through military success. He won repeated consulships and became associated with changes in recruitment and organization, although the traditional story of a single dramatic Marian reform is too simple. What did change over time was the relationship between soldiers, commanders, land, and political reward. Veterans looked to successful generals for settlement and benefits. Commanders gained prestige through victories and developed strong personal followings. Soon another ambitious general, Lucius Cornelius Sulla, marched an army on Rome itself during a dispute over command. After civil war, Sulla became dictator and attempted to strengthen senatorial authority. He eventually retired, but the precedent was difficult to erase. A Roman army could now become an instrument in domestic politics. The institutions of the Republic still existed, but armed power was moving closer to the center of political competition. Pompey, Crassus, and Caesar. The 1st century BCE produced commanders whose wealth and military reputations exceeded those of ordinary magistrates. Pompey won major victories in the eastern Mediterranean and reorganized large territories. Crassus became famous for wealth and played an important role in politics, though his campaign against Parthia ended disastrously at Carrhae. Julius Caesar belonged to an old family, but built his career through alliances, debt, office, and military command. The three men cooperated informally in what later historians call the First Triumvirate. Their arrangement was not an official constitutional body. It was a political partnership designed to help each man overcome opposition. When Crassus died and trust between Pompey and Caesar disappeared, the balance collapsed. Caesar was still in Gaul with experienced legions loyal to him. The question became whether he would return to Rome as a private citizen and risk prosecution, or bring his military power into Italian politics. Caesar in Gaul. From 58 to 50 BCE, Caesar campaigned across much of Gaul, roughly corresponding to modern France, Belgium, and neighboring areas. His own account, the Commentaries on the Gallic War, remains one of the major sources, but it was also a political document written by a participant who wanted to shape his reputation. Caesar defeated many different communities, crossed the Rhine, and led expeditions to Britain. Roman conquest was uneven and often violent, and local resistance continued. The most famous coalition formed around Vercingetorix, who was defeated after the siege of Alesia. Gaul gave Caesar wealth, veteran soldiers, and extraordinary prestige. It also permanently expanded Rome's northern world. Roads, towns, military settlements, trade routes, and local aristocracies would later connect the region closely to the empire. The landscapes of southern France and the Alpine approaches became part of a Roman corridor stretching from Italy toward the Atlantic. The Rubicon. In January 49 BCE, Caesar crossed the Rubicon River with troops, openly defying the Senate's demand that he give up command. Ancient tradition associated the moment with the phrase "the die is cast." Whether or not those exact words were spoken, the decision began another civil war. Pompey and many senators left Italy and gathered forces in the east. Caesar moved rapidly through the peninsula, then campaigned in Spain and Greece. At Pharsalus in 48 BCE, Pompey was defeated. He fled to Egypt, where he was killed. Caesar continued campaigns in Egypt, Asia Minor, Africa, and Spain before returning to Rome. He accumulated offices and honors, eventually becoming dictator for life. Supporters believed strong leadership could restore order. Opponents feared monarchy hidden behind republican titles. Rome had reached a constitutional crisis created by decades of imperial competition and personal armies. The Ides of March. On March 15, 44 BCE, a group of senators assassinated Caesar during a meeting. They claimed they were defending liberty and preventing kingship. But killing Caesar did not restore the old republic. The conspirators had no stable political settlement ready, and Caesar's supporters remained powerful. His funeral stirred public anger. His will adopted his young relative Octavian as son and heir. Mark Antony, an experienced commander and consul, tried to preserve his own influence. Another round of alliances and conflicts followed. Octavian, Antony, and Lepidus formed the Second Triumvirate, this time with legal authority. Their opponents were defeated at Philippi. Roman politics divided geographically, with Antony becoming dominant in the east and Octavian in the west. The Republic still existed in language and ceremony, but the real question was which leader would control the armies and provinces of the Roman world. Actium and the end of civil war. Mark Antony's alliance with Cleopatra VII of Egypt became central to the final struggle. Cleopatra was the ruler of a wealthy Hellenistic kingdom whose resources mattered greatly in Mediterranean politics. Octavian's propaganda portrayed Antony as a Roman corrupted by an Eastern queen, a powerful image that simplified a complicated civil war. In 31 BC, the fleets of Octavian and the combined forces of Antony and Cleopatra met near Actium on the western coast of Greece. Octavian's commander Agrippa won. Antony and Cleopatra retreated to Egypt and died the following year. Egypt became a Roman possession, and Octavian stood without a serious rival. After generations of civil conflict, Romans were exhausted. Octavian understood that openly declaring himself king would be dangerous. Instead, he would build a new political system using old republican language. Augustus and a new order. In 27 BCE, the Senate granted Octavian the honorific name Augustus. Historians usually mark this moment as the beginning of the Roman Empire, although there was no single day when the Republic simply vanished. Augustus carefully presented himself as the leading citizen rather than a monarch. He held a combination of powers that gave him control of key provinces, armies, and political institutions while magistrates and the Senate continued to function. This arrangement is known as the Principate. It allowed Romans to believe that traditional government had been restored after civil war, even though one man now possessed unmatched authority. Augustus reorganized military service, supported veteran colonies, developed administrative systems, and promoted building across Rome. His greatest achievement was political stability. The question that haunted his reign was whether the system could survive him. Rome under Augustus. Augustus famously claimed that he found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble. The statement was political self-presentation, but his reign did transform the capital. Temples were restored or rebuilt. Public spaces, roads, aqueducts, theaters, and monuments expressed a new age of order. The Forum of Augustus celebrated Rome's history and the emperor's family. The era Paces linked peace, fertility, religion, and imperial rule. Yet most residents still lived in crowded neighborhoods where apartment buildings, workshops, fountains, markets, and narrow streets created a very different experience from monumental marble. Rome may have had around 1 million inhabitants at its height, though estimates vary. Feeding such a population required grain shipments from Sicily, North Africa, and Egypt. The capital was therefore connected every day to the wider empire. A loaf of bread in Rome depended on ships crossing the Mediterranean. The Mediterranean Highway. Romans called the Mediterranean Mare Nostrum, RC. Under imperial rule, most of its coastline fell within a single political system. That did not make travel safe or easy, but it created remarkable connections. Ships carried grain, wine, olive oil, pottery, stone, metals, glass, fish sauce, luxury goods, soldiers, migrants, letters, and officials. Ports such as Ostia, Alexandria, Carthage, Ephesus, and Puteoli linked inland roads with maritime routes. Sailing remained seasonal and dependent on wind. Storms and shipwrecks were real dangers. Yet sea transport was far cheaper than moving heavy goods over long distances by land. The empire's economic geography therefore faced the water. Coastal cities prospered, and islands became stepping stones between regions. A calm view of the Mediterranean from above helps reveal why Rome could govern such a large space. Water did not only separate provinces. It connected them. A sea journey. Travel across the Roman Mediterranean depended on patience. A merchant or official waiting at a harbor could not simply choose a departure time and expect the sea to cooperate. Winds, currents, storms, and seasonal patterns shaped every voyage. Sailors watched the sky and coastline, stopped at islands, and relied on practical knowledge passed through generations. Ships often hugged familiar routes rather than crossing open water without reason. For passengers, a journey might include long, quiet hours of water and horizon, interrupted by crowded ports. This slower rhythm helps explain why coastal cities mattered so much. The empire's map was not only a map of provinces. It was also a map of harbors where people waited for favorable wind. Egypt and the imperial grain fleet. After Octavian defeated Antony and Cleopatra, Egypt became an especially important imperial possession. Its extraordinary agricultural productivity depended on the Nile, and its grain became essential to Rome's food supply. Alexandria was one of the largest cities in the Mediterranean, with harbors linking the Nile Valley to sea routes. Grain ships sailed toward Italy when seasonal conditions allowed, carrying cargoes large enough to attract attention in ancient accounts. Egypt also remained culturally distinctive. Greek, Egyptian, Jewish, Roman, and other communities lived within a complex social world. Temples continued older religious traditions while Roman officials administered the province in the emperor's name. For Rome, controlling Egypt meant controlling both wealth and food. The flow of grain from the Nile to the Tiber is one of the clearest examples of how the empire connected distant landscapes into a single system. North Africa and the granary of Rome. North Africa became one of the richest regions of the Roman Empire. After Carthage was finally destroyed in 146 BC and later refounded as a Roman city, the surrounding provinces developed extensive agriculture and urban networks. Grain and olive oil crossed the Mediterranean toward Italy in enormous quantities. Cities such as Carthage, Leptis Magna, and Thamagati gained forums, baths, theaters, temples, and aqueducts. Local elites participated in Roman political life while maintaining regional traditions. The Emperor Septimius Severus would later come from Leptis Magna in modern Libya. North Africa demonstrates how the empire's center and provinces depended on one another. Rome collected taxes and political loyalty, but the capital also depended on provincial food and commerce. The sea between Italy and Africa was not an outer boundary. It was one of the empire's busiest internal routes. Food from an empire. The Roman table connected distant regions. Olive oil from Hispania and North Africa arrived in large ceramic amphorae. Wine traveled from Italy, Gaul, Greece, and many local vineyards. Grain crossed the sea from Egypt, Sicily, and Africa. Fish sauce known as garum moved through commercial networks from coastal production centers. Dates, spices, fruit, cheese, legumes, bread, and preserved foods varied by region and wealth. Archaeologists can trace these movements through pottery stamps, shipwreck cargoes, rubbish deposits, and ancient warehouses. In Rome, a mountain of broken amphorae known as Monte Testaccio accumulated mainly from discarded oil containers. It is an unusual monument to consumption. Empire was not only visible in soldiers and governors. It appeared every day in kitchens, markets, taverns, bakeries, and the steady arrival of ships. Roads, bridges, and aqueducts. The Roman Empire is often remembered through infrastructure because so much of it survived. Roads allowed armies and officials to move, but they also supported civilian travel and trade. Bridges crossed rivers with arches that distributed weight efficiently. Aqueducts carried water from distant springs toward cities, often using gentle gradients over many kilometers. Only the most visible sections required dramatic arcades. Much of an aqueduct could run underground. In Rome, multiple aqueduct systems supplied fountains, baths, households, workshops, and public buildings. Engineering depended on surveying, quarrying, skilled labor, maintenance, and administration. These projects were not modern public utilities in the democratic sense. Emperors and local elites used them to display prestige and generosity. Still, they created durable systems that improved urban life. Roman power became visible in stone, brick, concrete, and flowing water. A day in a Roman city. Daily life varied enormously across the empire, but a Roman city shared certain rhythms. Shops opened toward the street. Bakers prepared bread. Vendors sold vegetables, oil, wine, fish, and prepared food. Craftsmen worked in small workshops. Public fountains provided water. Baths offered places to wash, exercise, talk, and conduct business. The Forum remained a center for law, religion, commerce, and public announcements. Wealthy families lived in large houses or suburban villas. Poorer residents often rented rooms in multi-story apartment buildings called insulae. Fire was a constant danger because cooking, lamps, workshops, wooden floors, and crowded streets brought flame close to combustible materials. Noise could continue late into the night. Yet the city also offered entertainment, employment, education, religious communities, and social networks. Roman urban life was crowded, unequal, energetic, and deeply dependent on the countryside that fed it. Villas and the countryside. Beyond the crowded cities lay farms, villages, estates, vineyards, olive groves, and pasture. Wealthy Romans sometimes built villas designed for both agricultural management and leisure. Some looked toward the sea or across gentle hills, with gardens, courtyards, mosaics, and shaded rooms. Most rural people lived much more simply and worked through demanding seasonal cycles. Harvests determined security. Drought, disease, or local conflict could quickly change a household's prospects. The empire depended on this countryside. Taxes, grain, wine, oil, wool, timber, and animals all began in rural landscapes before reaching towns and armies. A quiet flight over Italian fields, therefore, shows something just as Roman as the Forum or Colosseum, the land that sustained them. Baths and the rhythm of the afternoon. Public baths became one of the most recognizable features of Roman urban life. Large complexes offered heated rooms, cold pools, exercise spaces, gardens, libraries, and places to meet friends or conduct business. Smaller neighborhood baths served towns across the empire. Heating systems circulated hot air beneath floors and inside walls. Aqueducts and wells supplied water, while teams of workers kept furnaces burning and rooms functioning. Visiting the baths was not simply about hygiene. It was a social habit that crossed many class boundaries, though wealth still shaped the experience. The soundscape would have been lively: conversation, splashing water, exercise, vendors, attendants, and echoes beneath vaulted ceilings. In a quiet aerial view today, ruined bath complexes look still and geometric. In antiquity, they were among the busiest shared spaces of Roman daily life. Women and family in the Roman world. Roman public politics was dominated by men, but women were central to family, property, religion, business, and social networks. Elite women could influence political relationships through marriage, wealth, and family connections even without holding formal office. Many women owned property and managed estates or businesses. In towns, inscriptions reveal women as patrons, priestesses, shopkeepers, free women, and members of professional households. Marriage created alliances between families, while inheritance could shift wealth across generations. Childhood was shaped by status and survival. Infant mortality was high, and families experienced loss more often than modern societies accustomed to advanced medicine. Yet letters, tomb inscriptions, portraits, toys, and household objects also preserve affection and memory. Roman history is easier to understand when the grand political narrative is placed beside these quieter domestic lives. Citizens, free people, and the enslaved. Roman society was built around legal status. Citizens possessed important rights, though those rights differed by period, gender, wealth, and social rank. Free people without citizenship could live inside the empire and gradually gain new status through grants or military service. Enslaved people performed agricultural, domestic, industrial, administrative, and skilled work. Some lived under extremely harsh conditions, especially in mines and plantations. Others worked in households or businesses and could sometimes gain freedom, though freedom did not erase the inequalities of slavery. Free people became an important part of urban society and could build successful commercial careers. Roman citizenship itself expanded over time. In 212 CE, Emperor Caracalla granted citizenship to nearly all free inhabitants of the empire. This enormous change reflected how different the empire had become from the old republic. Rome was no longer simply one city ruling outsiders. It had become a vast political community with many local identities: law, citizenship, and a Roman identity. Rome's greatest political achievement may have been its ability to make Roman identity larger than the city itself. Citizenship expanded slowly through grants, colonies, military service, and political negotiation. After the social war in the early 1st century BCE, most free inhabitants of Italy gained Roman citizenship. Later emperors granted citizenship to individuals and communities across the provinces. Roman law developed categories for contracts, property, inheritance, marriage, and public authority that could function across a diverse empire. Local laws did not vanish, but imperial courts and legal principles created common frameworks. By the early 3rd century CE, when Caracalla extended citizenship to nearly all free inhabitants, being Roman no longer meant being born near the Tiber. A person in Spain, Syria, North Africa, or Gaul could belong to a local culture and also identify with the Roman state. Gods, rituals, and new beliefs. Roman religion included household rituals, public festivals, local cults, imported gods, imperial ceremonies, and philosophical traditions. Romans generally did not demand that every province worship exactly the same way. Local gods could be identified with Roman gods or continue beside them. Temples served religious and civic functions, and sacrifices were understood as part of maintaining proper relationships between community and divine powers. The emperor's position also gained religious meaning, especially in provincial imperial cults. At the same time, mystery religions and Eastern cults attracted followers across social boundaries. Judaism was an ancient monotheistic tradition with communities throughout the empire. Christianity emerged from the Jewish world of Roman Judea in the 1st century CE and spread gradually through cities connected by Roman roads and sea lanes. At first, it was one small movement among many. Over centuries, it would transform the religious landscape of the empire. Time, festivals, and the Roman year. Roman life moved through a calendar crowded with religious festivals, market days, public games, legal business, and family observances. The calendar itself changed over time. Julius Caesar introduced the Julian calendar in 46 BC, using a solar system with leap years that became the ancestor of the calendar used across much of the world today. Public festivals could close courts and interrupt ordinary business. Processions moved through streets. Temples received offerings. Families remembered ancestors and household gods. The year gave rhythm to political life as magistrates entered office and armies prepared for campaigning seasons. Even an empire of enormous size was experienced one day at a time, through recurring routines that made public life feel familiar. The Julio-Claudian emperors. Augustus was succeeded by Tiberius, beginning a sequence later grouped as the Julio-Claudian dynasty. The emperors Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, and Nero became famous in ancient literature, often through hostile senatorial authors. Their reputations must therefore be read carefully. What mattered structurally was that the imperial system survived changes of personality. Claudius expanded Roman rule in Britain. Nero's reign included the Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE, a disaster that destroyed large parts of the city. Ancient sources also connect Nero with persecution of Christians after the fire. When Nero died in 68 CE, the dynasty ended and several generals competed for power. The Year of the Four Emperors showed a dangerous truth. Armies on the frontiers could decide who ruled in Rome. Eventually, Vespasian emerged victorious and founded a new dynasty, the Flavians and the Colosseum. Vespasian and his sons Titus and Domitian restored stability after civil war. Their most famous monument became the amphitheater now called the Colosseum. Built in the center of Rome on land associated with Nero's private palace complex, it symbolically returned space to public use. Tens of thousands of spectators could watch gladiatorial contests, animal hunts, and other spectacles. The building's complex circulation system moved crowds through numbered entrances and corridors. Beneath the arena, later modifications created spaces for animals, equipment, and performers. The spectacles could be violent, but the building itself also reveals Roman mastery of concrete, arches, crowd management, and urban planning. For the sleep history listener, it is enough to imagine the monument at quiet dawn, before crowds entered, when morning light touched the outer arches and the city slowly woke around it. Pompeii beneath Vesuvius. In 79 CE, Mount Vesuvius erupted and buried Pompeii, Herculaneum, and surrounding communities under volcanic material. The disaster killed many people and transformed a living region into an archaeological time capsule. Pompeii was not a frozen ordinary day in every detail, because earthquakes and earlier activity had already affected the city, but its preservation is extraordinary. Streets, houses, shops, gardens, wall paintings, graffiti, temples, baths, theaters, and food remains reveal daily life with unusual intimacy. The Bay of Naples had been a wealthy and attractive part of Roman Italy. Villas overlooked the sea. Roads linked towns to ports and farms. Vesuvius dominated the horizon long before anyone understood the volcano as modern geology does. Today, an aerial view of the ruins with the mountain behind them creates one of the clearest landscapes in which ancient and modern times seem to touch. Trajan and the empire at its largest. Under Emperor Trajan, who ruled from 98 to 117 CE, Roman territory reached its greatest extent. Trajan conquered Dacia north of the Danube, a region rich in resources, and briefly extended Roman control deep into Mesopotamia during war with the Parthian Empire. His campaigns were celebrated in monuments such as Trajan's Column, whose spiral relief depicts scenes from the Dacian Wars. Yet large territory created large obligations. Garrisons, roads, supply lines, diplomacy, and administration all became more difficult as borders expanded. Trajan's successor Hadrian abandoned some eastern conquests and chose consolidation over endless expansion. This shift did not mean Rome had become weak. It meant imperial strategy was changing. The empire had reached a size at which maintaining existing provinces could be more valuable than adding new ones. Hadrian and the frontiers. Hadrian traveled extensively through the empire. Unlike an emperor who remained permanently in Rome, he visited provinces, inspected armies, supported building, and emphasized clear frontiers. The most famous surviving example is Hadrian's Wall in northern Britain, begun in the 120 CE. The wall was not an impenetrable barrier separating civilization from wilderness. It was part of a controlled military zone with forts, castles, roads, gates, settlements, and systems for movement and taxation. Similar frontier systems existed along the Rhine and Danube. Roman borders were places of interaction as much as defense. Soldiers traded with neighboring communities. Families lived near forts. Goods and ideas crossed in both directions. From the air, Hadrian's Wall follows ridges through green northern landscapes, a long line showing how the empire tried to turn geography into administration. The Rhine and Danube. Two great river systems shaped Rome's northern frontier. The Rhine and Danube were not perfect walls, but they offered transport routes, supply corridors, and recognizable lines for military organization. Forts and towns grew along their banks. Legions guarded crossings and roads. Merchants traded with communities beyond formal imperial territory. Roman coins, pottery, glass, and metal objects traveled north, while animals, raw materials, people, and information moved south. Emperors repeatedly campaigned in these regions because frontier politics never stood still. The rivers could protect Roman provinces, but they could also freeze, flood, or be crossed. What made the frontier work was not simply geography. It was a chain of forts, roads, patrols, alliances, and local relationships maintained generation after generation. Britain at the edge. Britain had entered the Roman world after Claudius's invasion in 43 CE, though conquest remained incomplete and resistance continued. Roman towns developed at places such as Londinium, Eboracum, and Verulamium. Roads connected military bases with civilian settlements. Villas appeared in the countryside. Baths, temples, markets, and imported goods linked parts of Britain to the wider imperial economy. Yet the province always lay near a frontier. Northern campaigns reached into what is now Scotland, but permanent occupation remained difficult. Hadrian's Wall marked one practical limit. Britain demonstrates how Romanization was never a simple replacement of local culture. People adopted Roman buildings, objects, language, and legal practices in different ways while maintaining regional identities. The empire was strongest when it could combine local life with imperial structures rather than demanding that every province look exactly like Rome. The Antonine Calm. The 2nd century CE is sometimes remembered as a high point of imperial stability. Emperors such as Antoninus Pius and Marcus Aurelius inherited a strong administrative system and prosperous provinces. This period should not be imagined as universal peace. Frontier wars continued, social inequality remained profound, and disease could travel along the same routes that carried trade. During Marcus Aurelius's reign, the Antonine Plague spread through the empire, probably carried by armies returning from the east. Its exact pathogen remains debated, but its demographic and economic effects were serious. Marcus also spent years campaigning along the Danube. The famous philosopher-emperor wrote private reflections now known as the Meditations, many of them while living near military frontiers. His reign reminds us that Rome's apparent calm depended on constant work, defending borders, collecting taxes, maintaining roads, feeding cities, and managing succession. The 3rd century crisis. In the 3rd century CE, the empire entered decades of instability. Emperors rose and fell rapidly, often supported by rival armies. External pressure increased along the Rhine, Danube, and eastern frontier. The Persian Sasanian Empire became a powerful competitor and even captured Emperor Valerian. Economic disruption, inflation, disease, and local separatist states weakened central authority. For a time, the empire divided into competing political zones. Yet Rome did not simply collapse. Local governments continued operating. Armies defended regions. Trade changed rather than disappearing. A series of capable emperors gradually restored unity. Aurelian reunited major breakaway territories and strengthened Rome's defenses with new walls. The crisis showed both the vulnerability and resilience of the imperial system. An empire that had seemed permanent could fracture, but the idea of Roman unity remained strong enough that rulers repeatedly fought to rebuild it. Diocletian reorganizes the empire. Emperor Diocletian, who came to power in 284 CE, responded to the 3rd century crisis with major reforms. He recognized that one ruler could not easily manage every frontier and administrative problem. The system later called the Tetrarchy divided imperial responsibility among multiple emperors. Provinces were reorganized, taxation became more systematic, and the army continued to evolve. Diocletian also emphasized imperial ceremony, making the emperor's position more distant and formal than under the early principate. His reign included the last major empire-wide persecution of Christians. The Tetrarchy did not remain stable after Diocletian retired, but his reforms changed the shape of late Roman government. The empire was becoming more regional, more bureaucratic, and more openly monarchical. Rome remained symbolically important, yet emperors increasingly governed from cities closer to strategic frontiers. Constantine. Out of the civil wars that followed the Tetrarchy, Constantine emerged as sole emperor. His reign reshaped Roman history. Before the Battle of the Milvian Bridge in 312 CE, Constantine associated his cause with the Christian God, though his personal religious development was gradual and complex. In 313, policies associated with Constantine and Licinius granted Christians legal toleration. Constantine later supported churches, bishops, and Christian institutions while traditional religions continued to exist. He also founded a new imperial capital at the site of Byzantium, rebuilding it as Constantinople. The city stood on the Bosphorus, where Europe and Asia meet and where shipping between the Black Sea and Mediterranean could be controlled. Its location was extraordinary. Protected by water on several sides and connected to eastern provinces, Constantinople became one of the most important cities in world history. Constantinople on the Bosphorus. Dedicated in 330 CE, Constantinople was designed as a Roman imperial capital with forums, palaces, churches, baths, monuments, and a great hippodrome. Over time, strong walls made it one of the best defended cities in the Mediterranean world. Grain and trade arrived by sea. Roads connected it with the Balkans and Anatolia. The Bosphorus below carried ships through a landscape of hills, inlets, currents, and distant horizons. The city's rise did not immediately diminish Rome, but it reflected a change in the empire's center of gravity. Wealthier and more densely populated eastern provinces increasingly mattered to imperial politics. Greek was widely spoken in the east, while Latin remained important in government and the western provinces. The Roman Empire was becoming culturally and administratively more diverse, even as emperors continued to claim authority over a single Roman world. Christianity becomes imperial. During the 4th century, Christianity moved from persecuted minority religion to a faith closely associated with imperial power. Constantine supported the Church and called the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE to address disputes over doctrine. Later emperors took different positions, but under Theodosius I, Nicene Christianity gained official imperial support while traditional public cults were increasingly restricted. This transformation was gradual and uneven. Pagan religious practice did not disappear in one moment, and Christian communities themselves disagreed over theology and authority. Churches rose in cities where temples had long dominated civic space. Bishops became important local leaders. Monasteries developed new forms of religious life. Roman administration and Christian institutions increasingly interacted. The empire that once executed Christians would eventually help spread Christianity across Europe and the Mediterranean. The empire divides. When Theodosius I died in 395 CE, imperial administration was divided between his sons, one ruling in the east and one in the west. The Roman Empire had been divided administratively before, so this did not necessarily seem permanent. Yet the two halves would now follow increasingly different paths. The Eastern Empire possessed wealthy cities, strong tax bases, major trade networks, and defensible strategic centers. The Western Empire faced long frontiers along the Rhine and Danube, political struggles among generals, and increasing difficulty maintaining revenue and armies. Groups described by Roman writers as Goths, Vandals, Franks, Suebi, and others moved within and across imperial borders for many reasons: warfare, migration, settlement, alliance, and pressure from other peoples. The old image of simple barbarian invasions misses this complexity. Many newcomers served Rome before establishing their own political power. Rome is sacked. In 410 CE, an army led by the Gothic king Alaric entered Rome and sacked the city. Rome was no longer the normal residence of Western emperors, but its symbolic importance was immense. For centuries, it had represented the center of Roman power. The shock was therefore psychological as much as military. Christian writers debated what the event meant. Pagan critics blamed the abandonment of traditional gods. Augustine of Hippo responded in The City of God, arguing that no earthly state could be eternal. Rome recovered from the sack, and the Western Empire continued for decades. Yet the event became a powerful marker of change. The city that had once sent armies across the Mediterranean could no longer guarantee its own security. The western provinces slip away. During the 5th century, Western imperial control weakened region by region. Vandals crossed into North Africa and eventually captured Carthage, depriving the Western government of one of its richest tax and grain-producing areas. Visigothic rulers established power in Gaul and Spain. Franks expanded in northern Gaul. Roman generals still commanded armies, negotiated alliances, and sometimes won important victories, but resources became increasingly limited. In 451, a coalition including Roman and allied forces confronted Attila and the Huns in Gaul. The Hunnic Empire soon fragmented after Attila's death, yet the Western Roman state continued to shrink. Political authority was becoming local. Former Roman provinces did not suddenly lose roads, cities, Christianity, Latin language, or Roman law. Instead, new kingdoms inherited parts of the Roman world and adapted them. 476 and the last Western emperor. In 476 CE, the military leader Odoacer removed the young Western emperor Romulus Augustulus. Later historians often use this date as the fall of the Western Roman Empire. To people living at the time, the change may have felt less dramatic than the modern phrase suggests. Western emperors had already lost much territory and authority. Odoacer ruled Italy while formally acknowledging the Eastern emperor. Roman senators remained. Laws continued. Taxes were collected. Churches functioned. The city of Rome endured. What ended was the regular line of separate Western emperors. The imperial title continued in Constantinople, where rulers still considered themselves Roman. The famous date of 476 is therefore useful, but it should not be imagined as a curtain falling across the ancient world in a single evening. Rome continues in the East. The Eastern Roman Empire survived the Western collapse by centuries. Modern historians often call it the Byzantine Empire, but its inhabitants called themselves Romans. Constantinople remained the imperial capital. Roman law was codified under Emperor Justinian in the 6th century. Eastern Roman armies briefly reconquered parts of North Africa, Italy, and Spain. Greek gradually became the dominant language of government, while Christianity shaped culture and politics. The empire changed enormously over time, facing Persians, Arabs, Bulgars, Crusaders, Turks, and many others. Yet the Roman political tradition remained alive until Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Empire in 1453. In that sense, Roman imperial history extends far beyond the familiar date of 476. The empire conquered the ancient Mediterranean, but its longest legacy may have been the institutions and identities that continued after the Western capital lost political control. The landscape Rome left behind. Across Europe, North Africa, and the Near East, traces of Rome remain embedded in the landscape. Roads lie beneath modern routes. Aqueduct arches cross valleys. Amphitheaters stand inside living cities. Fort walls follow old frontiers. Bridges still carry traffic. Latin inscriptions survive on stone. In many places, later builders reused Roman columns, bricks, and foundations. The empire also left less visible structures, legal ideas, municipal institutions, languages descended from Latin, Christian church networks, and political vocabulary. None of these survived unchanged. Medieval and modern society selected, transformed, and sometimes reinvented Roman traditions. The legacy of Rome is therefore not one inheritance, but many. Different communities remember different Romes: Republican Rome, Imperial Rome, Christian Rome, Military Rome, Legal Rome, Monumental Rome. Why Rome could endure? Rome's long success did not come from one secret. Geography helped. Roads helped. Military organization helped. But the deeper strength was the combination of flexibility and persistence. Rome could copy useful practices from enemies, offer allies a place inside its system, rebuild armies after defeat, and change institutions without admitting that everything had changed. The Republic became an empire while preserving republican titles. Foreign gods entered Roman religion. Provincial families entered the Senate. Emperors came from Spain, North Africa, and the Balkans. Each adaptation made Rome less like the small city that began beside the Tiber, yet Romans continued to describe the expanding system as Roman. That ability to change while maintaining a sense of continuity was one of the empire's most durable powers. A quiet return to the Tiber. After more than 1,000 years of history, it is fitting to return to the Tiber and the hills where the story began. The city that once controlled a Mediterranean empire eventually became one important center among many in a changing world. Yet the river continued to flow past bridges, ruins, churches, houses, and markets. The Forum became partly buried. The Colosseum changed uses. Ancient roads disappeared beneath later streets or stretched quietly into the countryside. Empires are often described through battles and rulers, but their deeper history is also made from landscapes, transport, food, labor, water, and memory. Rome conquered because it could build alliances, recover from defeat, organize armies, move resources, and adapt institutions. It endured because later generations continued to find meaning in what Rome had created. As the city settles beneath evening light, the ancient world feels distant, but its roads still lead into the present.